Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Better Call Saul, Season 3, Episode 5, Chicanery. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Better Call Saul. So I have to start with a spoiler warning for Better Call Saul up to Season 3, Episode 5. If you haven't seen up to this point, you may not want to watch this video, otherwise some things may be spoiled for you. So, wow. This episode just blew me away. Such a great episode. For a show about practicing lawyers, we had to wait until halfway through the third season to get our first full-blown courtroom drama episode, and it was magnificent. The show creators actually talked about how their idea for the show is to have a show about lawyers who never really spend time in the courtroom, but I think the fact that they did that even made it more great when we did get to spend an entire episode in the courtroom. It was amazing, and it was interesting that we spent the entire episode in Jimmy's storyline and didn't touch on Mike's storyline at all, and I was perfectly fine with that. In fact, I thought it was great to have a change of pace and a more focused episode. Not that I have anything against Mike's storyline, although I noticed a lot of people have been expressing preference for one storyline over the other. And when it comes down to it, I think I may say I slightly prefer Jimmy's storyline to Mike's, but I still do really like them both, and I want to see more of both of them. But for this episode, it was such a vital and important story to tell in Jimmy's overall story. I think it was important to have an episode focused entirely on it. So the episode is called Chicanery, which I have to admit I wasn't entirely familiar with this word, so I had to look it up, and the definition I read states the use of deception or subterfuge to achieve one's purpose. And it has some synonyms like deception, trickery, and deceit. And I find this title pretty interesting because in a way I didn't think Jimmy and Kim were being deceitful, because everything they did was not only above board, but the message that they got out there was in fact the truth. That Charles, his condition is mental, not physical, and that Charles' motivation is driven by jealousy and contempt for his brother. Therefore, I think the title is used ironically because Chuck himself uses the word to describe what Jimmy is doing when he goes on his rant. He pleads for the court not to fall for Jimmy's chicanery, because that's what Charles sees it. But Charles is clearly in the wrong, so it's only chicanery from his perspective, and in reality it isn't chicanery, although there was a lot of trickery involved in order to pull off what Jimmy did, but ultimately they just got to the truth. But more on that later. For the moment, I want to take it back to the start of the episode, where we get a flashback opening the episode, to which the show is often does, but in my opinion this is the most relevant flashback to the rest of the episode that the show has ever done. So this flashback most likely takes place shortly after Chuck's divorce and shortly after Chuck contracts his condition, and centers around Chuck trying to win Rebecca back. This takes place right when Chuck first moved into the house that we see him in throughout the show, and it's interesting to see Chuck and Jimmy teaming up to pull off this deception, this chicanery, if you will, to try to win Rebecca back. As Chuck comes up with a lame excuse for the power being out as to why there's no power, and Rebecca is obviously lured under false pretenses, and Jimmy tries his best to get her interested in Chuck again. And it's interesting to note that the excuse Chuck comes up with why the power's out is because some idiot got the numbers wrong on the addresses, eerily similar to what Jimmy did by mixing up the numbers of the addresses on Chuck's case. And it's possible that Jimmy actually got the idea from this, from Chuck. So Chuck was the one that came up with this story, this idea, this lie, and Jimmy took inspiration from him. That's really interesting. So anyway, Jimmy and Chuck team up again to try to win Rebecca over. And even though it was minor and totally legal, it's still interesting actually seeing Chuck and Jimmy team up to pull off a deception, considering the strain their relationship has always had. But I suppose this point in time shows when their relationship was at its strongest. So their plan seems to be going well with Rebecca, and Chuck whimsically is reminiscing about old times with her until she receives a phone call on her cell phone, to which of course Chuck starts freaking out and eventually snatches her phone and throws it across the room, which leads Rebecca to getting the hell out of there as quick as she can. What's interesting though is that Chuck refused to tell her about his condition, even when Jimmy insisted, as it would be better for her to see him as someone who is ill rather than a raging prick. And frankly, Jimmy's right, but Chuck outright refuses. Who knows why? Maybe pride? I don't know, but for some reason he really didn't want her to know. Anyway, this goes to show how much Jimmy really did care about Chuck and really did have his best interests at heart. So then we get into present day storyline where Jimmy and Kim get to spring their big trap. And I love this. I love how this whole thing played out. So whenever you have a heist movie or something where you know the main characters are scheming, something you can always tell whether or not their plan will go off without a hitch is by whether or not we actually see these characters putting the plan together and talking about what their plan is. Because if we do see them talk about their plan, then we know it won't go off without a hitch, and that they will experience some setbacks. Not everything will go as they plan. Otherwise, the execution of the plan would be boring to watch. However, if we don't see them talk about the plan and lay out the plan for the audience, this typically means that the plan will go off without a hitch, because the audience is still ignorant of what this plan actually is, so the fun comes in and sing and execute it. So in this case, with Jimmy's disciplinary hearing, the previous episodes made it clear that Jimmy and Kim were planning something and had something up their sleeves because they were really confident, but we didn't know what they were planning. So it was clear to me that their plan would go off without a hitch, but that only made me more excited to see what would happen next. Just like the whole show itself, which is a prequel, just because you know what's going to happen next doesn't make it any less interesting to see how it plays out, because you still don't know how it will happen. So it starts off with seeing Jimmy go to the vet that we've seen Mike go to whenever he wants something under the radar and not necessarily entirely legal. And he sees Jimmy's got a fish, and no doubt he got it for the express purpose of going to see this vet, and he needed to have a pet in order to, have a legitimate reason to see him. So he probably thought a fish was the easiest and lowest commitment pet. But it was funny to see the vet go off on him and how best to take care of a fish. But of course, the real issue was Jimmy wanting to hire someone to plant something on Chuck. So he asked for a pickpocket, but the best of the best. And the vet replies by asking Jimmy if he'll need to fit into tight spaces, to which Jimmy answered no, to which he replied, "I have just a guy." And as soon as he said this, I yelled out, "Huel!" Earlier in the season, we were introduced to Francesca. I almost speculated that we might see Huel this season as well, but then I thought, nah, it's probably too soon for that. But I was so excited to see Huel. He's always one of my favorite side characters from Breaking Bad. So when he did finally show up in this episode, when he bumped into Chuck, I jumped out of my chair and started cheering. I love Huel. So anyway, he was established on Breaking Bad as an expert pickpocket, as he was able to take the ricin cigarette from Jesse, which played a major role in the plot. So it's interesting that that's how Jimmy met Huel in the first place. So we then get a scene of Kim with her Mercer Verde clients, showing them that she's doing an exceptional job. Just goes to show that Jimmy was right, that Mercer Verde was better off with Kim. Anyway, she brings up what's going on with Chuck accusing Jimmy of tampering with his files involving their case, and I knew his response would be the one that he gave, where he said nothing upsets him more than when someone refuses to take responsibility for their own mistakes, and he makes it clear he wants to stay with Kim. Now, I'm not entirely sure how necessary this scene was to see, because it was already made pretty clear to us that Mercer Verde wouldn't be persuaded by the tape and would most likely stay with Kim. But it was interesting to get confirmation on that and to see what a good job she's doing. However, honestly, in this scene, I thought Kim was going to tell them that she was a bit behind on their case because she was busy working on Jimmy's case, but apparently that's not the case, and she was able to do an exceptional job on their case while still pulling off this masterpiece scheme with Jimmy on his case. So this, I guess, is where the montage we saw of Kim getting ready, where she just sleeps in her office so she can constantly work and just like goes for a shower at some health spa and then goes right back to work. And that this is where it explains, how she's able to get so much work done. So we also see Chuck getting ready as he scopes out the room that they're going to have the hearing in to make sure it meets his needs, where he has this little conversation with Howard, who is having second doubts about mentioning the tape because he doesn't want to dirty the name of HHM, but Chuck reasserts how important it is that Jimmy gets disbarred. Not just suspended, but disbarred. And then we see Chuck preparing at home what he's going to say about Jimmy because he wants to get it just right. And it's interesting how his voiceover sort of transitions to the scene of Jimmy and Kim sitting in court, who don't at all look concerned. So basically it's showing Chuck has overconfidence, it shows that, he thinks he has the advantage over Jimmy, but he's actually severely underestimating. So first we get Howard taking the stand. It's interesting what Kim gets him to say on cross, as she establishes that he thought he was a good worker and he used to call him Charlie Hustle. In fact, she refers to his becoming a lawyer as bootstrapping, as he studied while he was working in the mailroom. So puts a very positive spin on it, whereas Chuck wouldn't see it that way at all, because the way he sees it, that he took a shortcut. But more importantly, she points out that Chuck was the one who blocked Jimmy from becoming a lawyer. And of course, the prosecutor objects, but this is vital in establishing that Chuck has held a grudge against Jimmy. So it was at this stage I was starting to see what Jimmy and Kim's plan was, but I was still in the dark on some things. So then they proceed to play the tape, and this was a really interesting scene, hearing the dialogue from last year's finale, but seeing the reaction to everyone in the court. I think Kim actually felt flattered and even sweeter in Jimmy, and when Jimmy was talking about how he did it for her, but Jimmy was mostly embarrassed, and the disciplinary committee was mostly appalled. But all, the while we see Jimmy stalling and talking to Francesca about someone arriving from the airport. And then Chuck takes the stand for the prosecution, which goes pretty much as expected, with Chuck giving a pretty convincing song and dance about how he cares about his brother. But then we see who Jimmy is waiting for. It was Rebecca. So I'm still not entirely sure why she was there and why it was so important to Jimmy's case, because it was rather obvious in an overt attempt to rattle him, one in which he did in fact see right through. Although it could be argued that her presence there eventually did rattle him, but perhaps her presence there was more important because it showed the committee how Charles' condition affected him and its origins. Because we do learn in this episode that Chuck's condition first began shortly after his divorce, which is what I had suspected all along. And although Chuck denies this has anything to do with it, it is made clear by the end of the episode it is a mental condition, so it seems pretty apparent that it did begin because of Rebecca leaving him, so therefore her appearance would only make it worse. But it was interesting when Kim was telling Jimmy that Rebecca is going to hate him for what he was about to do, and that was a very effective device in really piquing my interest to see what it is he was about to do next. So it's really interesting that they actually had Jimmy do the cross-examination on Chuck. That surprised me, but I suppose that was the whole point on why Kim introduced herself as co-counsel with Jimmy McGill rather than his representation. I suppose they decided earlier on that it would be best if Jimmy was the one who confronted Chuck, and I must say he did an amazing job at keeping his cool and acting professional even when Chuck tried to rattle him and to goad him, and no one would know better on how to get Jimmy how to goad him than Chuck. But he never took the bait. He proved in that scene that he was in fact a great lawyer, and the whole scene was simply amazing. The whole time Chuck had a sense of superiority and thinking that he knew exactly what Jimmy would try to do and that his defense would be pathetic, and that's because he does think Jimmy is a horrible lawyer, and so he underestimated him. But in fact, Jimmy proved him wrong. And that's what made the scene so great. Not only because he exposed Chuck's ulterior motives, but also because he proved that he was a good lawyer by the expert way that he was able to do it. Just the way that he retorted whenever the other lawyer objected and managed to sway the committee to give him more leeway. It was so impressive and great lawyering. You could tell that Kim was really impressed with him. So, of course, as the viewer, I was just waiting for the other shoe to drop because we saw Huel plant something on Chuck and we saw Mike take pictures of the house. So I was just waiting to see, what use they would play. The pictures were obviously done to discredit Chuck and his competence, but at first I wasn't sure to what end. But during the trial, it started to become clear that they were trying to paint this as a simple brotherly feud. But doing the cross-examination, it became clear they were trying to imply that Jimmy simply, said those things on the tape to make Chuck feel better, which was a very smart way to go. In fact, when Jimmy asked the question, "How did you know that your provocation would work?" that was a damn smart question. I believe I actually cheered when he said that, because that's what I was thinking all along, that Chuck played on Jimmy's sympathy for his love for him, and Jimmy was super smart in pointing that out, that Chuck, that he did, which of course Kim had laid the groundwork for earlier with her questions about Jimmy caring for him. And the questions were, there to, the pictures were there to question Chuck's competence and his mental state. But I was just waiting for the Huel thing because I knew that that would be the kicker, as I pretty much knew what Jimmy was going to do, that he had Huel plant something electronic on Chuck to prove his condition was in fact mental. In fact, I first was thinking that it was a phone that Jimmy was going to call and it would go off in Chuck's pocket, but they went in a slightly different direction, which had simply being a cell phone battery. And I love how it started with Jimmy, showing his phone and Chuck discovering there was no battery in it, which made Chuck feel all smug and superior. It was like, "Ha, you're stupid, pathetic tricks, ha ha ha." But then Jimmy just did such a great job of provoking Chuck. It's probably part of the reason that they had Jimmy run the cross-examination instead of Kim, because they knew Chuck would be more provoked by Jimmy than Kim. But here's the main reason why I think Jimmy and Kim's strategy worked so well, because it was true. In fact, the only lie that they told was when Jimmy said he lied about doctoring the files, because, he didn't lie. He actually did doctor the files. And arguably that's quite a significant lie, but it was the only one. Everything else that they were saying about Chuck working against Jimmy this whole time because he had a grudge against him, and that Chuck's condition was actually mental, not physical, and that Jimmy had went out of his way to take care of Chuck. In fact, the only reason that he said what he did on the tape was to make Chuck feel better because he cared about him. All of that was true. When Chuck went off yelling about all the stuff Jimmy did in his childhood, and stuff that he did years ago prove their point exactly, that Chuck is jealous and resentful towards Jimmy, and that's why he was doing everything he was doing, and that was dead to rights the case. And that's how they were able to prove it so well, because it was true. In fact, I do believe that's kind of how Saul Goodman operated as a lawyer, by focusing on the truths of the situation that are in his favor in order to cover up the lies. And that was the smartest thing to do here, because that rant Chuck went on was pretty much exactly like several rants that he went on earlier, when he said things like Jimmy with a law degree was like a chimp with a machine gun. And they were trying to provoke him into saying something like that in court, because it proves their point exactly, that Chuck has a grudge against Jimmy. And then painting him as incompetent also showed that he probably just made the mistake himself, but he blamed Jimmy out of resentment and just died his own mistake. Of course, that part of it is a lie, but there is an element of truth to it. So it's interesting, ever since the time in season 1 where the doctor turned on the electricity on Chuck's hospital bed to prove it was all in his head, they never talked about this since, and Jimmy even continued to stand up for Chuck despite all that he's done for him. But here they finally used that information, because their whole plan hinged on the battery not hurting Chuck, and Chuck not even noticing that it was there, but they knew that he wouldn't notice because their experience with the doctor. And of course, Jimmy did bring up the doctor, who believed his condition was mental, but he didn't harp on it for too long. But what's really interesting is that now it is public record that his condition is mental and not physical. Not that I think there will be any consequences for Chuck because of this trial, because this trial was about Jimmy, not about Chuck. And the only consequence of Chuck's testimony will be that Jimmy keeps his law license. But it is now a matter of public record that his condition is mental, which takes him one step closer to Chuck being committed. And I still think that's what's coming. Because here's the thing, I don't think Chuck is simply going to let this go. He's not going to go home and go, oh well, I lost, time to move on with my life. He's going to be more pissed off than ever at Jimmy, and will try even harder to strike out at him. And in fact, he may do more damage that will eventually lead Jimmy with no choice but to have him committed. And another prediction I'll make is that Howard will no longer be on Chuck's side, because we saw before the trial that even then Howard was having doubts. And the thing is, I think Howard actually believed Jimmy's story about Chuck making up the doctoring in order to get back at Jimmy and hide his own mistake. And I will believe that and he will believe that Chuck is not competent enough to practice law. So I think this will have negative effects on Chuck's relationship with Howard and his standing at HHM, but we'll just see. So yeah, this is the first time we saw Jimmy not hold back on his brother and went all out on him, going as far as to expose his condition as mental. And I do believe he'll go even further before the season is done. And this is all started the moment Chuck had Jimmy arrested. While Jimmy was sitting there waiting for the police to come picking him up, he decided then and there he was done with Chuck, and Chuck was his enemy. And frankly, I don't blame him, because Chuck did indeed have it out for Jimmy and was letting petty jealousy and decades-old grudges drive him to sabotage him. The fact that Chuck had a point about Jimmy being a thief and that he still engages in illegal activity like fraud doesn't justify what Chuck has done to Jimmy and what he's been doing to Jimmy. Even after Jimmy sacrificed so much to take care of him, he's an ungrateful little fuck, in my opinion, and got exactly what he deserved. But that's just me. So my rating for Chicanery out of 10 is a 10, the best. I absolutely love this episode. It was courtroom drama at its very best. Everything about how it was executed, how the story very expertly divulged information was perfectly done. The acting was amazing, the dialogue was amazing, the sound design was amazing. Everything about this episode was amazing, and I dare say it will go down as one of my all-time favorite episodes of the entire show. So that's it for my review of Chicanery. Be sure to check back here every week as I continue to review episodes of Better Call Saul, and also be sure to check out my channel for many more videos I do on other shows like Game of Thrones, Star Trek, The Leftovers, Sense8, The 100, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. Thanks a lot for watching.